At my son's wedding, his bride pushed my wife into the mud in front of 300 guests. My son did not reach down to help his own mother. Instead, he put his arm around his new wife's waist and whispered something in her ear that made her laugh. I did not yell. I did not cause a public scene. I simply walked over to the microphone on the stage, tapped it to get everyone's attention, and said something no one in that room was expecting. Her own father set down his champagne glass. The band immediately stopped playing. My name is Richard Caldwell. I am 70 years old, and I spent 4 decades of my life building a commercial real estate empire right here in Boston, Massachusetts. If you are listening to this right now, I need you to pay close attention. What I am about to tell you is a story of calculated, cold-blooded betrayal committed by my own flesh and blood. If you have ever been taken for granted by the people you provided for, or if someone you loved weaponized your trust against you, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It gives this old man strength to know he is not speaking into a void. It all started exactly 6 months before that disastrous wedding day. I was pulled out of a deep sleep at 2 in the morning. My phone was vibrating relentlessly on the solid wood nightstand. I sat up, rubbing the heavy exhaustion from my eyes, and glanced over at my wife, Catherine. She was sleeping peacefully. Catherine had recently suffered a mild stroke, an event that left her slightly frail and needing a cane to walk. Because of that, I was always on edge, always hyper-aware of any sudden noise or alert in the house. I reached for the phone, fully expecting an emergency call from one of our property managers about a burst water pipe or a late-night security breach at one of our downtown high-rises. Instead, what I saw on the screen was an automated fraud alert from our primary corporate banking institution. I blinked, letting my eyes adjust to the harsh blue light of the screen. The notification was brief, but it hit me like a physical blow to the chest, forcing all the air out of my lungs. A wire transfer of $4 million had just been initiated and cleared from our main commercial holding account. $4 million. I threw off the covers, my heart hammering furiously against my ribs. I walked out of the bedroom, careful not to wake Catherine, and went straight down the long, dark hallway to my home office. My hands were visibly shaking as I booted up my laptop and logged into the secure executive banking portal. I told myself it had to be a system glitch, a banking error, perhaps an authorized vendor payment that had somehow gotten duplicated in the server. When you manage a company pulling in millions in annual revenue, large transactions are a normal part of daily operations. But a $4 million wire transfer at 2 in the morning without my prior verbal authorization, that was not normal. That was a massive screaming red flag. The portal loaded slowly. I clicked on the transaction history tab. The money was gone. It had been routed to an offshore account registered in the Cayman Islands. But that was not the part that made my blood run completely cold. I looked at the digital authorization signature attached to the wire transfer. It was not a hack. It was not an external security breach. The signature belonged to Preston Caldwell, my 35-year-old son and the chief operating officer of my company. I sat there in the dark, staring at his name on the glowing screen. Preston. The boy I had taught to ride a bicycle. The young man I had personally mentored, guiding him through every single department of Caldwell Developments, so he could one day confidently take over my legacy. I had trusted him completely. I had given him full executive clearance to manage our accounts, because I wanted him to feel the heavy weight of leadership. I wanted him to be ready to step into my shoes. A sickening heavy knot formed in the pit of my stomach. Why would my son wire $4 million to an offshore account in the middle of the night? Why didn't he consult me first? We had a very strict protocol for any capital movements over $500,000. He knew the rules backward and forward. I did not go back to sleep. I could not. I took a hot shower, put on my tailored business suit, and sat by the window, waiting for the sun to rise over the Boston skyline. Every minute felt like an eternity. My mind raced through a dozen different scenarios, desperately trying to find an innocent explanation. Maybe it was an emergency real estate investment opportunity he simply forgot to mention. Maybe it was a complex tax maneuver our corporate accountants had heavily suggested. I was a father fighting a losing battle against the sharp instincts of a seasoned CEO. My heart desperately wanted to believe there was a reasonable explanation, but my gut was already sounding the alarm. By 6 in the morning, I was in my car driving toward the financial district. The city was just waking up. The streets were quiet and draped in morning fog, perfectly reflecting the quiet storm brewing inside my mind. I pulled into the underground parking garage of our corporate headquarters. I did not greet the night security guard with my usual warm smile. I walked straight to the executive elevators, swiped my keycard, and pressed the button for the top floor. I stepped out into the quiet, carpeted hallway. The administrative staff had not even arrived for the day yet. The building was dead silent, but the lights were already on in Preston's office at the end of the hall. I walked toward his heavy glass door. I did not knock. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, letting it close heavily behind me. Preston was sitting behind his custom oak desk, casually sipping a cup of premium coffee and scrolling through his cell phone. He looked completely relaxed. There was not a single trace of panic on his face, not a hint of guilt in his posture. He looked up, mildly surprised to see me standing there so early in the morning. "Dad," he said, offering a bright, easy smile that felt entirely too practiced. "You are in early today. How is Mom doing? Did she sleep well?" I did not say a single word. I walked directly to his desk, pulled the freshly printed bank statement from my inner jacket pocket, and slammed it down flat on the polished wood right next to his coffee cup. "Explain this," I said. My voice was low, dangerously quiet, and completely devoid of any paternal warmth. $4 million, Preston. Routed to the Cayman Islands at 2 in the morning. Authorized by you. I watched his face closely, waiting for the sudden panic to set in. I fully expected him to stammer. I expected him to pale, to beg for forgiveness, to confess he had made a terrible, irreversible mistake. But he did not flinch. He did not even break eye contact. Instead, he leaned back in his expensive leather chair, let out a very soft, patient sigh, and looked at me with an expression of calm, calculated confidence. "Dad, please sit down," he said, his tone perfectly steady, bordering on condescending. "I can explain everything. It is actually for Mom." And right then, in that exact fraction of a second, my gut clenched. I knew the real nightmare was just beginning. I stood over my son, my chest heaving with anger, as the printed bank statement rested between us on his large desk. I searched his face for any sign of deception, any nervous twitch in his jaw, or a sudden shift in his gaze. There was absolutely nothing. Preston did not flinch. He looked up at me with the serene, patient expression of a professional managing a difficult client. My fury, which had been burning so hot just seconds before, hit a sudden wall of confusion. I pulled out the heavy leather chair across from his desk and sat down. I kept my eyes locked firmly on his. I demanded that he explain exactly how wiring $4 million of corporate liquid assets to a notoriously unregulated island nation overnight was somehow justified. Preston folded his hands neatly on his desk. He spoke in a soft, reassuring tone, the exact voice he used to close massive million-dollar commercial deals. He told me that ever since Catherine suffered her stroke, he and Victoria had been deeply worried about her long-term prognosis. He said they had been consulting privately with elite wealth management specialists for the past several consecutive weeks. According to Preston, the American healthcare system was designed to drain the assets of wealthy families through exorbitant private care taxes and liability claims. He claimed that Victoria, with her connections in international art consulting, had introduced him to a specialized offshore financial planner. Together, they established a special needs trust in the Cayman Islands. Preston leaned forward, his voice dripping with earnest concern. He explained that this offshore trust was a bulletproof, tax-free haven. If Catherine's condition were to suddenly deteriorate, if she ever required round-the-clock, specialized neurological care, this fund would absolutely guarantee her safety. He claimed she would receive the best medical attention in the world without forcing us to liquidate our domestic commercial properties. He looked me right in the eye and said he wanted to handle the initial transfer quietly because he knew how stressed I had been about her health. He wanted to surprise me with a fully funded, legally protected safety net for his mother. It was a masterful performance. Every single word was calibrated to strike directly at my deepest vulnerability. He used my overwhelming fear of losing my wife to justify an entirely unauthorized and highly suspicious financial maneuver. Before I could begin to dissect the legal holes in his explanation, the heavy glass door behind me clicked open. The timing was so flawless, it felt completely choreographed. Victoria walked into the office carrying 2 ceramic cups emitting the earthy scent of organic chamomile tea. She wore a tailored designer dress, her hair perfectly styled, looking like the absolute picture of elegant concern. She stopped when she saw me, feigning a gentle surprise, and then walked over to offer me one of the warm cups. She placed her manicured hand lightly on my shoulder, smiling down at me warmly. Her touch felt surprisingly cold, despite the warmth of the tea she had just handed me. She smiled her signature saccharine smile and told me how wonderful it was to see me in the office so early. Then, without missing a single beat, she looked over at Preston and asked if he had told me the good news about Catherine's medical trust yet. Victoria knelt slightly beside my chair, bringing her face level with mine. Her voice dripped with artificial sweetness. She told me she knew how heavily the burden of Catherine's recovery had been weighing on my tired shoulders. She said she could not bear to watch me worry anymore, and that as my future daughter-in-law, she felt it was her duty to step up and help protect our family. She praised my dedication as a husband, calling my love for Catherine an inspiration to both her and Preston. She said they just wanted to give back to the man who had given them everything. I sat there holding the warm cup, entirely surrounded by their perfectly synchronized narrative. Any seasoned executive knows that when a subordinate bypasses protocol, they either lack complete competence or basic loyalty, but they were deliberately using the one shield I could not immediately attack. They were using my wife. If I continued to rage against them right then, I would look like a stubborn, ungrateful old man rejecting a thoughtful gesture of familial love. I had to choose my next move with absolute precision. I took a slow sip of the tea, forcing my tense muscles to relax. I let out a heavy breath, intentionally sagging my shoulders, to mimic a man who was simply overwhelmed by relief and paternal gratitude. I told Preston that I deeply appreciated their immense concern. However, I stated clearly that he had blatantly violated corporate protocol. I kept my tone firm, but allowed a thick layer of fatherly exhaustion to bleed into my words. I instructed him to never initiate a capital transfer of that magnitude again without my direct written consent, no matter how noble his intentions were. Preston nodded submissively, offering a perfectly measured apology. He promised to have our corporate attorneys send over the full documentation of the trust by the end of the week. Victoria beamed brightly, squeezing my shoulder one last time, telling me everything was going to be all right. I finished my tea, stood up slowly, and told them I needed to head home to check on Catherine. As I walked out of that office and rode the elevator back down to the parking garage, the silence of the building felt completely suffocating. I had outwardly accepted their story. It was a plausible lie, brilliantly constructed with just enough financial jargon and emotional manipulation to pacify an anxious husband. But as I sat in the driver's seat of my car, staring blankly at the concrete wall of the parking structure, a dark, heavy seed of doubt suddenly took root. The pieces of their story fit together far too perfectly. Preston's unnatural calm when confronted with a $4 million discrepancy was alarming. Victoria arriving with 2 cups of tea at the exact moment the conversation required a soothing, emotional anchor felt staged. The casual use of my wife's medical crisis to bypass a heavily monitored corporate financial system was simply too convenient. None of it felt like a son making a clumsy but well-meaning mistake out of love for his mother. It felt entirely rehearsed. It felt exactly like a highly calculated contingency plan executed by 2 guilty people. They knew precisely what to say if they were ever caught in the act. I turned the key in the ignition, listening to the engine roar to life, but I did not drive home right away. I realized in that exact moment that I could not simply trust the word of a man who moved millions in the dark. I needed to verify their claims immediately. I needed to see the actual paperwork. I needed to know who actually controlled that offshore account. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed the direct line to my private legal counsel. I dialed the direct line to Jonathan Pierce. He was widely known as the most ruthless corporate litigator in Boston and had helped me navigate commercial real estate for 2 decades. He answered immediately. I told him about the $4 million wire transfer to the Cayman Islands and the suspicious medical trust Preston and Victoria claimed to have established. Jonathan went silent. When he spoke, his voice was tight with concern. He told me legitimate offshore trusts for medical care required months of rigorous legal structuring. They were never funded overnight in a single blind transaction. He promised to put his forensic accounting team on the routing numbers. I hung up feeling a fraction of relief. But as I navigated the morning traffic back to our estate, I had no idea the financial theft was only a distraction from a darker nightmare unfolding inside my home. When I walked through the mahogany front doors of our house, an unnatural quiet greeted me. Normally by 10 in the morning, the foyer would be echoing with the encouraging voice of Martha. She was the veteran physical therapist working with Catherine since her stroke. Under her compassionate routine, my wife had been making miraculous progress, regaining her mobility and her sharp personality. But the house was entirely silent. I walked into the sunroom. The brightly lit room was completely empty. Before I could call out for my wife, the door to the kitchen swung open. Victoria stepped into the hallway, followed closely by a woman I had never seen before. The stranger was dressed in a pristine white uniform that looked like a high-end spa tunic. She had a cold, clinical demeanor and carried a sleek leather medical bag. Victoria smiled at me, completely unbothered by my obvious confusion. She cheerfully announced that she had taken the liberty of upgrading Catherine's daily care. She claimed Martha was using outdated, grueling methods, putting far too much stress on Catherine's heart. Victoria introduced the stranger as a premium holistic wellness nurse she had personally hired through her elite social network. She explained this new nurse specialized in advanced neurological relaxation therapies, insisting this protocol would accelerate healing by focusing on deep rest. I stared at the 2 women, my jaw tightening. No one had consulted me about changing my wife's medical team. But once again, Victoria had masked a massive overstep with the perfect illusion of loving concern. I wanted to throw the stranger out of my house right then. But I remembered the $4 million. I knew that if I caused a massive scene, I would give them the exact ammunition they needed to paint me as an unstable, controlling husband. I swallowed, my anger nodded politely, and walked past them to check on my wife. Catherine was lying in our bed, the heavy blackout curtains drawn tightly shut. I sat on the edge of the mattress and gently took her hand. Her skin felt unusually cold. She opened her eyes, slowly blinking, as if the dim light was painfully bright. I asked her how she was feeling. Her response sent a shockwave of terror straight through my chest. Catherine tried to speak, but her words were a jumbled, incoherent mess. Her jaw seemed slack, and her usually bright, observant eyes were glazed over with a thick, milky fog. She mumbled something about being incredibly tired and let her head loll back against the pillows, falling asleep almost instantly. This was not the woman I had left just 4 hours ago. Just the night before, we had been sitting at the kitchen table laughing. She had been sharp and full of life. Now, she looked like a completely different person, rapidly slipping away into a deep, inescapable abyss. Over the next 3 days, her condition deteriorated at a terrifying pace. The holistic nurse arrived promptly every morning and stayed until late afternoon. She insisted on keeping Catherine confined to the bed, claiming absolute stillness was the core pillar of the regeneration protocol. Whenever I tried to sit with my wife, she was completely unconscious or staring blankly at the ceiling, unresponsive to my voice. She stopped eating solid food. She completely stopped even trying to sit up by herself. The slight limp she had from the stroke was no longer an issue because she could not even summon the basic motor function to move her legs. I was watching the love of my life wither away in front of my eyes. By the morning of the 4th day, my patience completely evaporated. I could not play the compliant, exhausted old man for 1 second longer. I waited in the hallway until I saw Victoria leave the house for her art consulting meetings. As soon as her car pulled out of the driveway, I marched up the stairs and threw open the door to the master bedroom. The nurse was standing by the bedside table holding a small plastic cup filled with water. Catherine was slumped against the headboard, her breathing shallow and labored. I stepped between the nurse and my wife, my physical presence demanding absolute authority. I demanded to know exactly what was happening. I kept my voice low so I would not startle Catherine, but the raw, unfiltered fury in my tone was impossible to miss. I pointed directly at the frail, helpless form of my beloved wife and stated that she was absolutely not regenerating. I told the nurse that Catherine was declining rapidly, losing her basic cognitive functions, and that this holistic approach was actively destroying her progress. I demanded a full, comprehensive list of every single vitamin supplement and treatment being administered in my house. I told her I wanted the contact information for her medical director and the name of the agency that licensed her. The nurse did not step back. She did not show a single ounce of intimidation or professional respect. Instead, she let out a short, patronizing sigh and looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated arrogance. She calmly placed the plastic cup back onto the nightstand and crossed her arms over her chest. She told me that she completely understood my emotional distress, but that I was severely overreacting to a normal phase of neurological adjustment. Then, she delivered a sentence that made the blood freeze in my veins. She stated that her non-disclosure agreement and private care contract were signed exclusively by Victoria Sterling. She claimed Victoria held the authorized wellness proxy for Catherine's daily treatments. The nurse boldly told me she answered only to Victoria and Preston, and that my constant interference actively disrupted her medical protocol. She essentially told me in my own house, standing next to the bed I had shared with my wife for 40 years, that I had absolutely no authority over her care. They had systematically isolated my wife using Victoria's expertise to completely box me out of the decision-making process. Preston and Victoria were deliberately keeping Catherine incapacitated. The terrifying trap they had meticulously built was far more insidious, deeply cruel, and profoundly evil than any simple act of corporate financial theft could ever be. I was completely alone in this fight. The nurse stood there with her arms crossed, waiting for me to lose my temper. She wanted me to give her a reason to call security. She wanted to prove to Preston and Victoria that I was an unstable old man interfering with my wife's medical care. I took a deep breath, forcing my hands to unclench. I looked at Catherine, who was staring blankly at the wall, lost in whatever chemical fog they had pushed into her veins. I promised her silently that I would fix this. Then, without saying another word, I turned and walked out of the bedroom. I went straight downstairs to my study and locked the door. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely unlock my desk drawer. Every instinct I had developed over 40 years in commercial real estate was sounding a deafening alarm. I knew my wife was not suffering from a natural neurological decline. She was being systematically poisoned in her own bed. But knowing the truth and proving it were two entirely different things. I needed physical evidence. I needed to know exactly what was inside that small plastic cup. I sat at my desk and watched the security monitors I had installed years ago for perimeter defense. 2 hours passed. The house remained dead silent. Finally, around 1 in the afternoon, the front gate camera showed the nurse walking out to the courtyard. She pulled out her cell phone, lit a cigarette, and began pacing near the garden fountain. She was taking her lunch break. This was my only window of opportunity. I moved quickly and quietly. I slipped out of my study and walked up the carpeted stairs. I opened the door to the master bedroom. Catherine was still asleep, her breathing shallow. The nurse had left her sleek leather medical bag sitting on the velvet armchair near the window. I walked over to the bag, my heart hammering relentlessly against my ribs. If the nurse walked back in and caught me rummaging through her supplies, Victoria would have the perfect excuse to legally bar me from my own bedroom. I unzipped the main compartment of the leather bag. There were blood pressure cuffs, sterile syringes, and basic medical charting tablets. I carefully sifted through the standard supplies. There were several small brown bottles labeled with common holistic vitamins like liquid B12 and magnesium. It all looked completely legitimate. It looked exactly like the premium wellness protocol Victoria had claimed it was. But I knew better. I ran my fingers along the interior lining of the bag, pressing against the thick leather fabric. Near the bottom corner, my thumb brushed against a hard, rigid lump concealed behind a zippered seam. I pulled the zipper back. It was a hidden thermal insulated pocket. Inside, resting perfectly in a molded foam insert, were 3 identical glass vials. I pulled one of the vials out and held it up to the light. The glass was cold. But the most terrifying detail was the label. It had been intentionally peeled off. There were only sticky remnants of paper left on the glass, deliberately masking whatever chemical was inside. No legitimate medical professional removes the labels from the medication they are administering to a vulnerable patient. This was an active cover-up. I did not have much time. I pulled a sterile plastic syringe from the main compartment. I carefully pierced the rubber stopper of the unlabeled vial and extracted a small amount of the thick, clear liquid. I transferred the liquid into an empty travel-sized eye drop bottle I had grabbed from my bathroom cabinet. I wiped the vial clean, placed it back into the foam insert, and zipped the hidden pocket shut. I arranged the medical bag exactly as the nurse had left it. I kissed Catherine on the forehead and slipped out of the room just seconds before I heard the front door open downstairs. I went straight to the garage and got into my car. I drove directly into the heart of downtown Boston, bypassing the standard medical clinics. I knew that if I went to a normal hospital, the bureaucratic red tape would take days, and the results would be uploaded to a digital system where Preston could potentially access them. Instead, I drove to a private toxicology laboratory that frequently handled rapid drug testing for elite corporate security firms. I walked into the sterile lobby and placed the small eye drop bottle on the reception counter. I pulled out a stack of $100 bills and told the head technician I needed a complete chemical breakdown of the liquid inside. I told him I needed the results rushed. I paid him $3,000 in cash for priority testing and sat in the waiting room. I sat in that stiff plastic chair for 4 agonizing hours. My mind was consumed by images of my wife lying helpless in that dark room. Finally, a tall man in a white lab coat walked out of the double doors leading to the testing area. He was holding a printed lab report. His expression was incredibly grim. He asked me to step into his private office. I followed him, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. He closed the door, handed me the paper, and sat behind his desk. He looked at me with genuine alarm. He told me that the liquid I had brought in was absolutely not a vitamin supplement. It contained no natural organic compounds whatsoever. The technician took a deep breath and explained the chemical breakdown. He told me the vial contained a highly concentrated synthetic mixture of haloperidol and lorazepam. I asked him what that meant in plain English. He looked me dead in the eye and told me those were incredibly potent liquid antipsychotics and heavy sedatives. He explained that these specific medications were exclusively designed to be administered in secure psychiatric facilities to physically subdue aggressive, violent patients experiencing severe manic episodes. He told me that administering this cocktail to an elderly woman recovering from a stroke was not just medical malpractice. It was incredibly dangerous and highly illegal. I stared at the laboratory report in my trembling hands. The complex chemical names blurred together on the page. The devastating reality of the situation crashed down on me with the force of a freight train. Preston and Victoria were not just stealing my money. They were actively chemically lobotomizing my wife. They were intentionally frying her neurological pathways to keep her compliant, silent, and physically trapped in that bed. They were turning her into a living vegetable so they could completely eliminate her as an obstacle. The rage that exploded inside my chest was completely blinding. I thanked the technician, walked out of the laboratory, and stepped into the cold Boston evening. The grief had burned away completely. I was completely consumed by a cold, calculating desire for absolute destruction. I was going to tear my son's entire world apart. I was going to make sure Preston and Victoria paid for every drop of poison they forced into my innocent wife. Today, or at least that was my immediate instinct. As I sat in my car outside the toxicology laboratory, gripping the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned completely white. The blinding heat of my rage demanded immediate and brutal retribution. I wanted to drive straight home, kick the heavy mahogany front door off its hinges, and physically drag that so-called holistic nurse out into the street. I wanted to grab my own son by the collar of his expensive custom suit and demand to know exactly how he could look his own mother in the eye while slowly stripping away her humanity. I wanted to burn everything to the ground, right then and there. But then the cold, highly analytical mind of a man who had spent 40 years surviving the incredibly cutthroat world of Boston commercial real estate slowly took over. I took a deep, shuddering breath, closed my eyes, and forced myself to think 3 steps ahead. If I stormed into that house screaming about poisoned vials and offshore accounts, Preston would instantly pivot. He was an absolute master of corporate manipulation. He would immediately destroy any remaining digital evidence of the Cayman Islands wire transfer. He would quietly pay off the holistic nurse and ensure she completely disappeared before the police could ever bring her in for questioning. He would look at the authorities with a perfectly calibrated expression of sorrow and claim that the immense stress of Catherine's illness had simply triggered a severe paranoid delusion in his aging, overworked father. And because he had already laid the groundwork, because he had already started painting me to the staff as an exhausted, overwhelmed caretaker, people would actually believe him. I would lose my company, I would lose my freedom, and most importantly, I would lose my ability to protect my vulnerable wife from their terrifying scheme. I could not afford to let my raw emotions dictate my strategy. If Preston and Victoria wanted to play a dangerous game of deception, I was going to show them exactly why I was the man who built the massive empire they were actively trying to steal. I started the engine, drove back to the estate, pulled slowly into the garage, and took one final moment to entirely compose myself. I wiped the anger from my face. I let my shoulders sag forward, intentionally adopting the defeated posture of a man who was crumbling under the heavy, suffocating weight of his tragic circumstances. When I walked into the kitchen, Preston and Victoria were sitting comfortably at the marble island, casually reviewing a thick stack of floral arrangements for their upcoming wedding. They looked up as I entered. I did not glare at them. Instead, I rubbed my temples aggressively and let out a long, shaky sigh. I stumbled slightly on my way to the refrigerator, making sure to heavily brace my hand against the countertop, as if I had suddenly lost my physical balance. Victoria immediately stood up, her face twisting into that familiar, sickening mask of fake concern. She rushed over, placing a gentle hand on my back, asking if I was feeling all right. I looked at her with tired, deliberately unfocused eyes. I told her I was just feeling incredibly exhausted. I mumbled something entirely fabricated about my memory slipping, claiming I had driven all the way downtown to pick up some highly important files from the office, only to realize I had completely forgotten what I was looking for. I let my voice waver just enough to sound genuinely vulnerable and afraid. I told them the relentless stress of Catherine's condition was finally catching up to me, and that I felt like my mind was constantly shrouded in a thick, inescapable fog. The reaction was incredibly subtle, but to a man actively looking for it, it was as bright as a distress flare in the night sky. Preston glanced over at Victoria. He did not say a single word, but the corner of his mouth twitched upward into a brief, unmistakable smirk. It was a look of pure, triumphant arrogance. Victoria patted my shoulder gently and guided me toward one of the bar stools, speaking to me in the slow, patronizing tone one might use for a highly confused toddler. She told me I needed to stop pushing myself so hard and that I should just leave the heavy lifting to them. They genuinely believed their insidious plan was working flawlessly. They thought the psychological pressure was successfully breaking my spirit. They had absolutely no idea that they were looking directly at a carefully constructed trap. I politely excused myself, claiming I needed to lie down for a few uninterrupted hours. I slowly walked up the stairs, seamlessly maintaining the frail facade, until the heavy oak door to my study finally clicked shut behind me. The exact moment the lock engaged, the exhausted old man completely vanished. I pulled a secure prepaid burner phone from my concealed personal safe. I had purchased it years ago for highly sensitive corporate acquisitions. I dialed a number I had memorized over 2 decades of doing business in Massachusetts. Jonathan Pierce answered on the second ring. Jonathan was not just a lawyer. He was a ruthless, brilliantly tactical corporate litigator who treated the law like a devastating weapon of war. We had fought countless bitter battles together, expertly dismantling rival developers and completely crushing hostile takeovers. I did not bother with any pleasantries. I told him I needed to see him immediately, and that it absolutely could not be at his firm or my office. I told him my son was actively attempting to seize Caldwell Developments and was chemically incapacitating my wife to facilitate a massive medical competency trap. There was a heavy, chilling silence on the other end of the line. Jonathan was a man who rarely showed emotion, but I could hear the absolute shock radiating in his breathing. He quickly gave me the address of a private windowless conference room in a highly secure building he owned in the financial district. He told me to use the service elevator hidden in the alleyway and to make absolutely sure I was not being followed by anyone. Exactly 1 hour later, I sat directly across from Jonathan at a long steel table. I laid out absolutely everything. I showed him the official toxicology report, confirming the dangerous presence of heavy antipsychotics. I gave him the precise routing numbers for the $4 million overnight transfer to the Cayman Islands. I explained the sudden convenient appearance of the holistic nurse and the entirely fabricated story about the Special Needs Trust. Jonathan meticulously reviewed the physical documents with cold, terrifying precision. He did not offer empty words of false comfort. He treated the situation exactly as it was. It was a highly coordinated hostile siege on my entire life. Jonathan leaned back methodically, tapping his expensive pen against the smooth desk. He told me that Preston was not just acting out of simple greed. He explained that establishing untraceable offshore accounts and utilizing unregulated private medical staff required an incredibly sophisticated level of dark premeditation. He explicitly warned me that if Preston was bold enough to systematically poison his own mother, he would not hesitate to initiate a massive legal strike against my mental competency within a matter of weeks, perhaps even days. Jonathan stated clearly that we needed irrefutable, undeniable evidence of their malicious intent before we could safely involve the federal authorities. We needed to capture their direct confessions, their true motives, and their exact timeline without them ever suspecting they were being watched. I looked at Jonathan, the strategic plan already forming in my mind. I told him that Preston and Victoria felt entirely comfortable discussing their darkest plans inside my house because they firmly believed my wife was comatose and I was completely oblivious. I needed to turn my own home into a total surveillance grid. I needed hidden ears in the walls. Jonathan nodded slowly, a dark mutual understanding passing between us. He told me he knew exactly who to call. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a sleek black mobile device. He explained that he retained a highly specialized private intelligence team composed exclusively of former federal agents. They were elite experts in discrete audio and visual surveillance typically utilized for high-stakes corporate espionage cases. Jonathan warned me that deploying them inside my own private residence was a massive legal risk, but considering the immediate physical threat to my wife, it was a necessary tactical escalation. He tapped a few buttons on his device and told me the team could be completely mobilized and ready to deploy by the weekend. I leaned forward, clasping my hands tightly together on the cold steel table. I told him the weekend was absolutely perfect. I explained my strategy to create the perfect, uninterrupted window of opportunity. I would purchase an all-expenses-paid weekend getaway for Preston and Victoria at an exclusive luxury spa in Vermont. I would simply frame it as an early wedding gift, a tangible expression of my deep gratitude for all their hard work regarding Catherine's daily care. They were far too greedy and incredibly arrogant to ever refuse a free luxury vacation. Once they were completely out of the state, The private intelligence team would have completely unrestricted access to the entire Boston penthouse and my primary estate. Jonathan smiled a grim, razor-sharp expression that promised absolute destruction for my enemies. I left Jonathan's secure building feeling a strange, hollow sense of anticipation. The pieces of the board were finally moving into place. When I returned to the estate, I found Preston and Victoria sitting in the formal dining room finishing a late dinner. I joined them, pouring myself a glass of sparkling water. I kept my hands remarkably steady. I told them that I had been doing a lot of deep reflecting on my drive earlier. I said I realized just how incredibly selfish I had been acting lately. I apologized for letting the severe stress of Catherine's condition make me so paranoid and irritable. Victoria immediately softened her posture, offering me a sympathetic nod. Preston told me it was completely understandable, playing the part of the gracious, forgiving son. Then I laid out the bait. I pulled a thick, embossed envelope from my jacket pocket and slid it across the mahogany table. I told them that I wanted to show my profound gratitude for everything they were doing to manage the company and oversee Catherine's private care. I explained that I had booked them an all-expenses-paid weekend at the premier luxury wellness retreat in Vermont. I insisted they leave on Friday afternoon and return late Sunday evening. I told them they desperately needed the time to decompress and reconnect before their massive upcoming wedding. Victoria opened the envelope. Her eyes widened as she saw the sheer value of the premium reservation. She looked at Preston, her face lighting up with genuine greedy excitement. They accepted the gift without a single moment of hesitation. To completely guarantee that they would not suddenly decide to return to Boston early, I added one final crucial layer to the deception. I casually mentioned that while they were enjoying the fresh mountain air, I was going to have their downtown penthouse undergo a comprehensive termite fumigation. I told them our property management team had noticed some severe wood damage on the top floor of their building, and the entire unit needed to be sealed and treated for 48 hours. Preston frowned slightly at the inconvenience, but I quickly assured him that a professional cleaning crew would air the place out and perfectly sanitize everything before they returned on Sunday night. He agreed, completely blinded by the prospect of a free luxury vacation. The trap was now perfectly set. Friday afternoon arrived with a heavy, looming sense of finality. I stood by the front window of my study, watching Preston load their expensive leather luggage into the trunk of his car. Victoria was chatting animatedly on her cell phone, completely oblivious to the fact that she was driving straight out of the war zone she had created. The moment their vehicle turned the corner and disappeared down the street, I picked up my burner phone and sent a single text message to Jonathan. Less than 45 minutes later, an unmarked gray utility van pulled into the private service driveway of Preston and Victoria's luxury penthouse building in downtown Boston. Because I legally owned the entire commercial structure, I had authorized absolute clearance for the team to bypass the standard lobby security protocol. I met the private intelligence team inside the penthouse. There were 4 men in total. They wore unmarked dark clothing and moved with the silent, terrifying efficiency of men who had spent their entire careers operating in the dangerous shadows of federal law enforcement. They did not ask any unnecessary questions. They simply opened their heavy tactical cases and went straight to work. I stood in the center of the massive open-concept living room, watching them systematically dismantle the privacy of my son's life. One agent carefully removed the cover of the central air conditioning vent, installing a microscopic audio receiver deep inside the metallic ductwork. Another agent meticulously integrated a high-definition wide-angle camera lens directly into the digital face of the smart thermostat mounted on the living room wall. They moved into the private home office, wiring secondary audio transmitters into the baseboards and concealing a tiny camera within the binding of a thick, decorative encyclopedia on the bookshelf. The technology was absolutely breathtaking and completely invisible to the naked eye. It took them less than 3 hours to turn the entire luxury penthouse into a fully operational military-grade surveillance grid. Every single conversation, every hushed whisper, and every private meeting held within those walls would be instantly transmitted to a secure offshore server controlled directly by Jonathan's forensic team. But the penthouse was only half of the battlefield. We still needed to penetrate the corporate stronghold. At 11 o'clock that night, the intelligence team and I entered the silent, deserted headquarters of Caldwell Developments. Using my ultimate executive clearance, we completely bypassed the night watchman and disabled the primary security cameras on the top executive floor. We walked down the dark, polished corridor and stopped directly in front of Preston's heavy glass door. The team moved with breathtaking speed. They accessed his private office and began planting the final layer of surveillance. They hid a microscopic audio bug inside the heavy base of his custom oak desk lamp. They installed a secondary camera directly into the housing of the smoke detector located directly above his primary workspace. I stood by the large floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the glittering Boston skyline. I had spent 40 entire years building this company from the ground up. I had poured my absolute soul into every single brick and steel beam of this corporate empire. And now I was actively bugging the office of my own flesh and blood. The profound sadness of the situation threatened to crush my chest, but the terrifying memory of Catherine lying completely incapacitated in her bed forced my spine to straighten. I was not invading my son's privacy. I was actively gathering the ammunition required to save my wife's life. Once the agents finished the physical installation, we walked down to the subterranean parking garage where their surveillance van was actively monitoring the incoming digital feeds. I stepped inside the dark vehicle. The glowing computer monitors illuminated the small space. On the screens, I could clearly see pristine high-definition video feeds of Preston's office and the penthouse living room. The audio was incredibly crisp, capturing even the soft hum of the building's ventilation system. The digital trap was fully armed, perfectly concealed, and absolutely lethal. I thanked the intelligence agents for their precise work and drove back to my estate under the cover of night. I walked into the dark house, went straight to the master bedroom, and sat quietly beside Catherine's bed. I held her fragile hand in the dark, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing. I silently promised her that our enemies were going to pay for every single ounce of suffering they had caused. We just needed to wait for them to completely expose their brutal intentions. The very next phase was entirely up to their monumental greed. I knew the truth was coming. I was perfectly prepared to face the absolute worst reality imaginable without letting my profound grief destroy my focus. The weekend moved with an agonizing slowness. I spent Saturday and Sunday sitting by my wife's bedside, holding her hand, while my mind remained locked on the invisible surveillance grid we had successfully deployed across the city. By Monday evening, the intelligence team had compiled the first batch of intercepted communications. I left my estate just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, driving through the heavy Boston traffic toward the financial district. I arrived at Jonathan's secure building and took the private elevator down to the subterranean level. The heavy steel door to his soundproof conference room clicked shut behind me, sealing us in complete isolation. Jonathan was already sitting at the head of the long table, staring intensely at a sleek black laptop. He did not offer any pleasantries. He simply gestured to the empty leather chair beside him and handed me a pair of high-fidelity studio headphones. I slipped them over my ears, adjusting the padded cups as Jonathan pressed a button on his keyboard. A soft, rhythmic static hissed through the speakers, followed immediately by the crystal-clear sound of ice clinking against heavy crystal glassware. We were listening to a recording captured inside the downtown penthouse. The audio quality was so incredibly sharp that I could actually hear the distinctive sound of expensive scotch being poured from a heavy decanter. Preston let out a long, satisfied sigh. He told Victoria that the vintage single malt tasted infinitely better when he knew he was drinking it in a luxury penthouse he would never actually have to pay for. Victoria laughed, a sharp grating sound that echoed through my headphones. She asked him how this great pioneer of Boston commercial real estate was holding up. Preston scoffed loudly. He confidently declared that I was fading much faster than he had ever originally anticipated. He mocked the way I had stumbled in the kitchen the previous week. He cruelly mimicked the tired, shaky voice I had used when complaining about my failing memory. He told his future bride that my brain was turning to mush and that I was nothing more than a pathetic, senile old man who had completely lost his edge. Listening to your own flesh and blood enthusiastically celebrate your perceived physical and mental deterioration is a deeply sickening experience. A cold, heavy stone settled deep in my stomach. I looked across the table at Jonathan, who maintained a completely blank, stony expression. I did not let my grief break my concentration. I tightened my grip on the edge of the steel table and focused entirely on the voices. Victoria told Preston that they needed to be incredibly careful not to rush the final timeline. She reminded him that managing an elderly patient required meticulous pacing, so the medical authorities would not ask any unnecessary questions. Just as Preston began to reply, a loud, sharp buzz interrupted their conversation. It was the penthouse intercom system. Preston muttered something under his breath and walked across the room. I heard the heavy front door unlatch and swing open. A third voice entered the audio frame. It was a voice I recognized immediately. Harrison Sterling. Victoria's father stepped into the apartment. He sounded completely out of breath, panting heavily, as if he had just run up several flights of stairs. The entire atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The relaxed, arrogant banter completely vanished, replaced immediately by a thick, suffocating tension. Harrison demanded a drink. I heard him pacing frantically back and forth across the hardwood floor, his expensive leather shoes clicking rapidly. Victoria asked her father what was wrong, her voice suddenly tight with genuine alarm. Harrison slammed a glass down on the counter with terrifying force. He did not sound like the polished, untouchable business mogul he always portrayed himself to be at our high society dinner parties. He sounded like a cornered, desperate animal. He told Preston that the timeline had officially shifted and that the men he owed money to were completely out of patience. He said they had paid him a personal visit at his private club that afternoon, and they were no longer accepting his excuses or his promises of future payments. Preston demanded that Harrison lower his voice and calm down, but Harrison was completely unraveling. He explicitly stated that his massive debt to the Boston crime syndicate had ballooned to $20 million. $20 million of dirty, untraceable mafia money. He told Preston that the syndicate leaders had explicitly threatened to break both of his legs and dismantle his entire gallery operation if they did not receive a massive, multi-million-dollar wire transfer by the end of the month. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. I stared at the laptop screen in absolute horrified disbelief. Harrison Sterling was not a wealthy art investor. He was a complete fraud, drowning in a lethal ocean of organized crime debt, and my son was standing right in the middle of it. Preston told Harrison to stop panicking. He spoke with the cold, detached authority of a man actively managing a massive criminal conspiracy. My son explicitly assured his future father-in-law that the capital was already being secured. Preston proudly confessed that he had spent the last 3 months systematically siphoning Caldwell Development's commercial holding assets through a complex web of offshore dummy corporations. He told Harrison that the initial $4 million had already successfully cleared the Cayman Islands accounts, and that the remaining $16 million would be fully liquidated and transferred before the wedding. I felt physically sick. My own son was actively bleeding my life's work dry to pay off blood money to a violent criminal syndicate. Victoria chimed in, demanding to know what Preston was getting out of this massive risk. Preston laughed a dark, greedy sound that made my skin crawl. He reminded Harrison of their primary agreement. In exchange for bailing Harrison out of a literal death sentence with the mafia, Preston was guaranteed a massive 50% ownership stake in Harrison's supposedly lucrative future commercial ventures, along with complete control over Victoria's entirely fictional trust fund. Preston was willing to risk federal prison, destroy my entire legacy, and actively poison his own mother just to secure a massive unearned fortune for himself. He wanted to be a kingmaker, using my hard-earned empire as his personal piggy bank. The sheer magnitude of their deception was staggering. I pulled the headphones off my ears and let them rest around my neck. The silence of the secure room felt incredibly heavy. Jonathan looked at me, waiting for my reaction. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply looked at the digital timer on the screen. There were still several hours of intercepted recordings left to review. I closed my eyes for one brief moment, gathering every ounce of strength I had left in my aging body. I took a very slow, deep breath, picked up the heavy studio headphones from the table, and placed them firmly back over my ears. I instructed Jonathan to play the next audio file, knowing the terrifying nightmare was only going to get much darker. Jonathan tapped the keyboard, his face a mask of professional focus. The timer reset, and a new audio file began to play through my studio headphones. The background noise indicated that Preston and Victoria were no longer entertaining Harrison in the living room. The acoustic signature told me they had moved into the master bedroom. I heard the sound of a closet door sliding shut, followed by the rustling of fabric. Victoria was packing a bag. She told Preston she had just received an email from their offshore account manager. She confirmed the $4 million wire transfer had cleared the banking hurdles. Preston let out a sigh, asking if she had finalized the beneficiary paperwork. Victoria laughed, a cold sound echoing into my ears. She proudly told him the Special Needs Trust was registered exclusively under her name, with zero legal provisions attached for my wife. The money was theirs, insulated from any corporate audits or legal claims. My hands tightened into fists as the recording continued. Preston began pacing the bedroom floor. His voice was laced with impatience. He complained bitterly that despite their orchestrated psychological pressure, I was not deteriorating fast enough to fit their timeline. He told Victoria that my clarity in his office regarding the wire transfer had terrified him. He stated that I was still too sharp, too observant, and that my lingering presence at the company was becoming a liability. He whined that if I decided to run an audit before the wedding, I would discover the gaps in the commercial portfolio. Preston sounded like a greedy child who was angry that his father refused to roll over and die. He asked Victoria what they were going to do if I demanded the legal documents for the offshore medical trust by the end of the week, as I had warned him I would. Victoria did not share his panic. Her voice dropped to a soothing whisper, but the words she spoke were pure evil. She told Preston to stop worrying about my random bursts of clarity. She instructed him to keep paying the holistic nurse to continue dosing Catherine with the antipsychotics. Victoria calmly explained that watching his beloved wife turn into an unresponsive vegetable was destroying my emotional foundation. She assured Preston that severe emotional trauma would naturally mimic the symptoms of rapid cognitive decline. Then she laid out the ultimate endgame. Victoria stated that they just needed to maintain the illusion of a happy family until the wedding ceremony was over. She said that once they were legally married, the dynamic of authority would permanently shift. Victoria told him that on Monday morning, the very first business day after the wedding, they would file a joint medical competency petition with the state court. The magnitude of her plan began to unfold. Victoria confidently outlined how they would use Catherine's chemically induced catatonia as undeniable proof of our deteriorating household. They would present my episodes of fabricated forgetfulness combined with my intense emotional distress to paint me as an unstable husband who was failing to manage my wife's medical crisis. Victoria stated that the court would inevitably grant them emergency medical and financial guardianship. She promised Preston that by Tuesday afternoon, they would lock both me and Catherine in a secure state-run dementia ward. She explicitly emphasized the words state-run, implying they would not even spend a fraction of their stolen money to place us in a comfortable private facility. We would be stripped of our cell phones, our legal representation, and our basic human rights entirely isolated from the outside world. With both of us legally declared incompetent and locked away in a psychiatric facility, Preston would immediately seize my corporate voting rights. Victoria calmly calculated that with absolute executive control, Preston could rapidly liquidate 3 of our most valuable commercial blocks in downtown Boston. She explained that selling those properties slightly below market value would generate more than enough untraceable liquid capital to pay off her father's violent mafia creditors in full. They would secure their blood-soaked fortune, save Harrison from his crippling syndicate debts, and permanently bury the only two people who could ever expose their corporate theft. Victoria finished her terrifying monologue by pouring another drink and telling Preston that by this time next month, they would be sitting on a private beach in the Caribbean, entirely free from the suffocating burden of his aging parents. The recording ended with the sharp click of the microphone cutting out. I slowly removed the studio headphones and placed them gently on the smooth steel table. The silence in the secure conference room was absolutely deafening. I felt as though the oxygen had been sucked out of my lungs. I was not just dealing with a greedy, ungrateful son trying to steal an early inheritance. I was dealing with two highly organized, ruthless predators who were actively plotting to erase my wife and me from society. They were planning to steal our freedom, our dignity, and our entire future simply to fund their lavish lifestyle and pay off mob debts. The reality was so monstrous that it paralyzed my cognitive functions. I looked over at Jonathan. His jaw was clenched so tightly that a prominent vein pulsed in his neck. He had spent decades fighting corporate predators, but even he looked deeply disturbed by the pure malice we had uncovered. Jonathan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He told me that we now possessed the absolute undeniable proof of criminal conspiracy, grand larceny, and severe elder abuse. He stated that the audio recording detailing the medical competency trap was the exact ammunition we needed to completely obliterate them in a federal courtroom. Jonathan warned me that we were now operating on an incredibly tight, highly volatile timeline. We had slightly less than 3 weeks before their wedding day. If we allowed them to reach that Monday morning, they would immediately initiate the competency petition, and the resulting legal battle would be an absolute nightmare. We had to preemptively strike with such overwhelming, devastating financial and legal force that Preston and Victoria would be stripped of their weapons before they realized they were under attack. I sat processing Jonathan's strategic assessment. The overwhelming grief that had crushed my chest was suddenly replaced by a cold, radiating, and absolute sense of purpose. Preston had built his entire criminal strategy on the foolish assumption that I was a weak, oblivious old man who could be easily manipulated and discarded. He had completely forgotten who had taught him everything he knew about ruthless corporate warfare. I looked directly into Jonathan's eyes, my gaze hardening into solid ice. I told my lawyer that we were not just going to stop them. We were going to systematically dismantle every aspect of Preston's life. We were going to quietly strip away his corporate power, drain his stolen financial resources, and trap him inside his own magnificent deception. I instructed Jonathan to immediately begin drafting the aggressive legal countermeasures his firm had ever produced. I was going to teach my son a lesson in corporate survival. I left Jonathan's secure conference room that night as a completely different man. The suffocating grief that had been crushing my chest for weeks was entirely gone. It had been incinerated by a cold, radiating sense of absolute clarity. I had less than 3 weeks until the wedding. Less than 3 weeks before my son and his future bride initiated their terrifying legal strike to lock my wife and me in a psychiatric ward. They were planning to effectively erase my entire existence from the outside world and leave me rotting in a sterile room while they celebrated their stolen victory. The timeline was incredibly tight, and the margin for error was absolutely zero. If Preston noticed even a single fractional discrepancy in the corporate ledgers before the trap was fully set, he would panic. He would immediately accelerate his competency petition, and the resulting legal war would destroy everything. I needed to execute a financial maneuver so massive and so incredibly stealthy that he would not feel the blade until it had already pierced his heart. The very next morning, I walked into the downtown headquarters of Caldwell Developments at 6 o'clock sharp. I bypassed my usual morning coffee and went straight to my private executive suite. I locked the heavy oak doors and booted up my encrypted terminal. Jonathan had already mobilized his elite legal team overnight. We were initiating a strategy known in the highest tiers of corporate warfare as a ghost protocol. Our primary objective was not to fight Preston for control of the company. Our objective was to completely hollow out the company from the inside, leaving him fighting for absolute control of a worthless empty shell. At exactly 8 o'clock, Jonathan sent over the preliminary digital paperwork through a highly secure encrypted server. Over the course of his decades in commercial litigation, Jonathan had perfected the art of creating impenetrable financial fortresses. We were establishing a massive, irrevocable trust registered in the state of Delaware. Delaware corporate law is famous for providing absolute anonymity and unparalleled asset protection. By structuring the legal entity as an irrevocable trust, I was permanently removing the assets from my personal estate and placing them under the absolute protection of a designated independent trustee. Once the assets crossed the digital border into the trust, they were legally untouchable. No creditor, no hostile corporate takeover, and certainly no fraudulently obtained medical competency ruling could ever force the liquidation of those funds. Preston and Victoria were banking their entire murderous scheme on their ability to seize my personal wealth once I was declared legally incompetent. But they could not seize what I no longer legally owned. I spent the first 48 hours meticulously signing over the digital deeds to our most lucrative commercial real estate properties. I transferred the ownership rights of 3 massive downtown office buildings, 4 luxury residential complexes, and a highly profitable shopping plaza located right in the heart of Boston. These were the exact properties Preston had bragged about liquidating to pay off his future father-in-law's $20 million mafia debt. The sheer audacity of using my lifelong achievements as a simple bargaining chip to appease violent criminals fueled my silent, relentless mission. I watched the progress bar on my monitor as decades of my literal blood, sweat, and tears were systematically migrated into the dark, protective shadow of the Delaware Trust. The sheer psychological tension of executing this massive financial exodus right under my son's nose was physically exhausting. Every afternoon, Preston would casually stroll into my office to discuss minor operational details or complain about the rising costs of his lavish wedding catering. He would stand across from my desk wearing his expensive tailored suits, projecting the arrogant confidence of a man who believed he was already the undisputed king of the castle. I had to summon every single ounce of willpower to maintain my facade. I would deliberately rub my temples, slow my speech, and ask him to repeat simple financial figures just to feed his illusion of my rapidly declining cognitive state. He would smile a sickeningly patient smile, gently assuring me that he had everything completely under control and that I just needed to focus on resting. He had absolutely no idea that while he was standing there mocking my perceived weakness, my hands were resting on a keyboard that was actively draining the very empire he thought he was conquering. I watched him walk out of my office, completely unaware that his glorious future was evaporating right before his eyes. His arrogance was his ultimate vulnerability, blinding him to the massive shifting of power happening just inches away from his expensive leather shoes. Over the next 3 days, the extraction process escalated to the company's core intellectual property. I quietly transferred the exclusive ownership rights of our proprietary architectural software and our highly lucrative commercial development patents. Everything of tangible value was stripped from the Caldwell Development's corporate registry. The final phase was the most dangerous. I had to move the massive liquid capital reserves without triggering an internal audit alert. I knew that if the compliance department flagged a sudden, enormous drop in operational liquidity, Preston would receive an immediate notification on his phone and the entire operation would be catastrophically compromised. I waited until late Friday evening, specifically timing the massive capital migration for when Preston was attending a highly publicized charity gala with Victoria. I sat alone in my dark office, the glowing light of the computer screen illuminating the quiet room. I initiated a sequence of heavily encrypted, staggering wire transfers. I watched as tens of millions of dollars in corporate liquid assets flowed out of our primary holding accounts. The money cascaded through a complex labyrinth of holding companies before finally coming to rest safely inside the impenetrable vault of the Delaware Trust. When the final digital confirmation flashed across my screen, I let out a long, shaky breath. The operation was officially complete. Over the course of 5 agonizing days, I had systematically transferred exactly $150 million in commercial real estate, exclusive patents, and raw liquid capital completely out of the company. I logged out of the terminal and looked around my beautiful executive office. Outwardly, absolutely nothing had changed. The corporate logo still shined brightly in the lobby. The hundreds of employees would still come to work on Monday morning. But structurally, Caldwell Developments was now completely hollow. It was nothing more than a magnificent, terrifying ghost ship. Preston was scheduled to officially take over the financial reins after his wedding. He firmly believed he was stepping into the cockpit of a perfectly oiled, wealthy commercial juggernaut. He thought he had secured the $20 million he desperately needed to save Harrison from the violent Boston syndicate. He thought he had outsmarted his tired, senile old father. He had absolutely no idea that he was now the chief operating officer of a worthless, empty corporate shell. Every dollar was hidden in the dark, waiting for the perfect moment to be revealed. My son was about to face the wrath of the demons he had so foolishly invited. The morning after I successfully drained Caldwell Developments of every valuable asset, the Boston sky was heavy with dark storm clouds. It was a fitting backdrop for the destruction I was about to unleash. I sat in the passenger seat of Jonathan's black sedan as his driver navigated the slick streets toward the John F. Kennedy Federal Building. My briefcase rested heavily on my lap. Inside that leather satchel was the digital equivalent of a nuclear bomb. We were carrying the raw audio recordings from the downtown penthouse, alongside a meticulously organized binder containing every fraudulent wire transfer Preston had executed over the past 6 months. We were crossing a terrifying, irreversible line. We were no longer simply protecting my commercial real estate empire. We were officially initiating a federal criminal prosecution against my own son. Jonathan and I passed through the rigid security checkpoints and were immediately escorted to a sterile, windowless conference room deep inside the Financial Crimes Division. A few minutes later, the heavy door opened. 2 men in crisp, tailored suits walked into the room. The lead investigator introduced himself as Special Agent Mitchell Carter. He had sharp, assessing eyes and the rigid, exhausted posture of a man who spent his entire life untangling the darkest webs of corporate corruption. He sat down across from us, opened a legal pad, and bluntly asked Jonathan why the most feared corporate litigator in Massachusetts was requesting an emergency off-the-record meeting with federal authorities. Jonathan did not waste a single second on pleasantries. He opened his briefcase and slid the thick binder of financial documents across the table. He told Agent Carter that we were officially reporting a massive ongoing wire fraud and embezzlement operation originating from within the executive suite of Caldwell Developments. Agent Carter flipped open the binder. He skimmed the first few pages, his expression remaining perfectly neutral. He noted the $4 million transfer to the Cayman Islands and asked if this was simply a case of a greedy executive siphoning corporate funds. He stated that while it was a serious crime, it usually fell under the jurisdiction of standard white-collar prosecution, not an emergency federal intervention. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cold metal table. I looked directly at Agent Carter and told him the offshore wire transfers were merely the tip of a much larger, infinitely more dangerous iceberg. I reached into my briefcase, pulled out a small digital audio player, and placed it right in the center of the table. I told him that my son was not acting alone, and he was not stealing the money to fund a lavish lifestyle. I pressed the play button. The crisp, high-definition audio from the hidden penthouse microphone filled the sterile conference room. Agent Carter listened with absolute silence as the recording played. He heard Preston and Victoria casually discussing the horrific plan to chemically lobotomize my wife and trap us both in a psychiatric facility. But when the audio shifted, when Harrison Sterling frantically entered the apartment and began hyperventilating about his massive debts, the atmosphere in the room completely changed. The moment Harrison explicitly mentioned the $20 million he owed to the Boston crime syndicate, Agent Carter sat up completely straight. When Harrison named the specific individuals who had threatened to break his legs and dismantle his gallery operation, the second agent in the room actually gasped out loud. Agent Carter paused the recording. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of absolute shock and predatory excitement. He told me that the FBI had been actively investigating that specific criminal syndicate for the past 4 consecutive years. They knew the mafia was aggressively using high society businessmen like Harrison to clean their dirty money through elite art transactions and bogus commercial investments. However, the federal prosecutors had never been able to secure the definitive financial paper trail required to secure a conviction. The criminals were simply too insulated, heavily protected by layers of shell companies and offshore accounts. Agent Carter looked at the binder, then at the audio player, and finally back at me. He stated that I had just walked into his office and handed the federal government the ultimate golden goose. By providing the exact offshore routing numbers Preston was using to funnel the stolen corporate capital directly into the syndicate's accounts, I had given the FBI the exact map they needed to completely dismantle the entire criminal organization. The agents were practically vibrating with adrenaline. Carter immediately stood up, declaring that he needed to mobilize a tactical strike team. He wanted to secure arrest warrants for Preston, Victoria, and Harrison by the end of the day. He wanted to raid the penthouse before they had any chance to move the remaining $16 million. I reached out and placed my hand firmly over the binder. I pulled it slightly back toward my side of the table. I looked up at Agent Carter, my expression as hard and unyielding as solid granite. I told him that nobody was getting arrested today. Agent Carter frowned, confused and suddenly defensive. He reminded me that this was now an active federal investigation involving a highly dangerous organized crime syndicate. He stated that I did not have the authority to dictate how and when the FBI executed their operations. Jonathan casually adjusted his expensive silk tie and stepped into the negotiation. He reminded the agents that the digital files currently sitting on the table were entirely encrypted. He explained that I held the sole decryption keys required to legally access the Cayman Islands banking portal. Without my direct voluntary cooperation, the FBI would spend months fighting international legal battles to unseal those offshore accounts. By the time they successfully gained access, the mafia would have completely drained the funds and vanished into the wind. I was holding the absolute leverage, and I was fully prepared to use it. I told Agent Carter that I was entirely willing to hand over every single password, every secure token, and every shred of audio evidence. I would give them the Mafia Harrison and my own treacherous son on a silver platter. But in exchange for wrapping this massive investigation up in a neat little bow, they had to agree to my exact, non-negotiable timeline. I required the element of absolute devastating surprise to guarantee my wife's complete safety. Agent Carter slowly sat back down, folding his hands together. He asked me exactly what I wanted. I looked him dead in the eye and laid out my final condition. I told him that in exactly 2 weeks, Preston and Victoria were hosting a massive, incredibly lavish wedding. I instructed Carter to let the criminals feel comfortable. I demanded that the FBI execute the arrest warrants publicly in the middle of the wedding reception, right in front of all 300 guests. I wanted to watch their perfect illusion shatter into pieces under the heavy weight of their monumental, unforgivable greed. A slow, grim smile spread across his face. He extended his hand across the table, securing our brutal pact. The ultimate trap was officially locked in place. The ultimate trap was officially locked in place. But as Jonathan and I walked out of the federal building and into the humid Boston afternoon, a crushing realization settled over my shoulders. We had successfully secured the timeline for the FBI raid, but that timeline required waiting 2 full weeks until the wedding. I could perfectly manage the corporate deception for 14 days. I could easily smile at Preston and pretend my empire was not already a ghost ship, but I could not leave my beloved wife at the mercy of that holistic nurse for another 2 weeks. The heavy antipsychotics were actively destroying her neurological pathways. If they continued injecting that poison into Catherine's veins every single morning, the woman I loved might never fully recover her cognitive functions. I needed to neutralize the medical threat immediately, but I had to do it with such absolute precision that Victoria and the nurse would never suspect a thing. If the nurse noticed the medication was missing or altered, she would immediately alert Preston, and the entire federal operation would collapse before it even began. I instructed Jonathan's driver to take me to a private medical supply distributor on the outskirts of the city. I walked into the unassuming warehouse and purchased a dozen glass vials of sterile saline water, making absolutely sure the physical dimensions of the glass perfectly matched the hidden vials I had discovered inside the nurse's leather bag. I returned to the estate just before noon. The house was quiet, carrying that same heavy artificial silence that had haunted our halls since the nurse arrived. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, watching the security feed on my phone. Just like clockwork, the nurse stepped out onto the back patio for her afternoon cigarette break. I moved silently up the grand staircase and slipped into the master bedroom. Catherine was lying perfectly still, her chest rising and falling in a shallow, chemically induced rhythm. My heart ached as I looked at her pale face, but I pushed the grief aside and focused entirely on the leather bag resting on the armchair. I unzipped the main compartment, found the hidden thermal pocket, and pulled out the 3 glass vials of antipsychotics. Using a sterile syringe from the supply store, I carefully extracted the dangerous liquid from their vials and flushed it safely down the master bathroom sink. I then refilled their original unlabeled glass vials with the harmless sterile saline water. I wiped the glass completely clean, sealed the hidden pocket, and stepped out of the room. The poison was gone. Victoria was paying thousands of dollars a week for a corrupt nurse to inject my wife with nothing more than purified salt water. The real challenge was waiting for the heavy sedatives to fully clear Catherine's system. The first 2 days were agonizing. The nurse continued her daily injections, completely oblivious to the fact that she was administering harmless water. She would proudly report to Victoria that the holistic regeneration protocol was keeping Catherine in a state of deep healing rest. I simply nodded and thanked her for her dedication. But by the morning of the 3rd day, the dense chemical fog finally began to lift. I was sitting in the velvet armchair, reading a newspaper after the nurse had left for the evening. The room was bathed in the soft golden light of the setting sun. I heard a sudden sharp intake of breath from the bed. I immediately put the paper down and walked over. Catherine was staring at the ceiling, but her eyes were no longer milky and vacant. The sharp, intelligent focus that had defined her entire life was rapidly returning. She slowly turned her head and looked at me. She blinked several times, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. She reached out her hand, trembling slightly, and grabbed my wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong. She asked me why her mouth tasted like metal and why her memories felt like they were buried under a thick layer of mud. I sat on the edge of the mattress and took her face in my hands. The moment had arrived. I knew that telling a mother her only son was actively trying to destroy her would be the most devastating conversation of our 40-year marriage. I spoke in a low, steady whisper. I told her absolutely everything from the very beginning. I explained the $4 million offshore transfer, the fraudulent corporate contracts, and the terrifying audio recordings we had intercepted from the downtown penthouse. I told her about Harrison Sterling's massive debts to the Boston crime syndicate and exactly how Preston was bankrupting Caldwell Developments to buy his way into a fictional fortune. Finally, I told her the horrific truth about the holistic nurse. I explained that the exhaustion and the terrifying mental fog were not side effects of her stroke. I told her that Victoria and Preston had been intentionally injecting her with heavy psychiatric medication to keep her perfectly incapacitated. I revealed their ultimate sickening plan to file a medical competency petition on the Monday following the wedding, fully intending to permanently lock us both in a state-run dementia ward for the rest of our natural lives. Catherine stared at me in absolute horrified silence as the monstrous reality of her son's betrayal washed over her. Tears welled up in her beautiful eyes and spilled down her pale cheeks. She wept for the boy she had so carefully raised. She wept for the maternal love she had freely given, completely shattered by such unfathomable, ruthless greed. I held her tightly against my chest, letting her release the profound agony of a mother mourning the living death of her child's morality. We sat there together in the quiet, darkened bedroom for a very long time. But Catherine Caldwell was not a fragile or easily broken woman. She had stood firmly by my side while we built a ruthless commercial real estate empire from absolutely nothing. When the initial wave of shock finally subsided, the tears completely stopped. She pulled back and looked at me. The sorrow in her eyes had been entirely replaced by a cold, radiating, and magnificent fury. She demanded to know exactly what my tactical countermeasure was. I detailed the entire ghost protocol. I explained exactly how I had financially hollowed out the company into an irrevocable trust and heavily coordinated the public FBI raid for the upcoming wedding reception. A slow, fiercely determined understanding settled over her elegant features. She wiped the very last tear from her cheek and told me she was perfectly ready to play her designated part. We firmly agreed that she had to maintain the absolute flawless illusion of severe cognitive decline. For the entire next week, she would continue to deliberately slur her words, stumble awkwardly whenever she walked, and stare blankly at Victoria. She was perfectly willing to act the part of a broken, dying woman, knowing with absolute certainty that her deceptive performance was the absolute key to springing the ultimate trap upon them. We were perfectly prepared for the final, absolutely devastating battle. The wedding day arrived under a sky as clear as a polished diamond, but the air around me felt thick and suffocating. 300 guests had descended upon the historic Boston estate, their expensive perfumes mingling with the scent of freshly cut roses. I moved through the crowd like a ghost wearing a tuxedo that felt heavier than a lead vest. Everywhere I looked, I saw the fruits of my lifelong labor, the lavish floral displays, the world-class catering, the endless stream of vintage champagne. All of it was purchased with money stolen directly from my corporate holdings, yet my son Preston moved among the crowd with the unearned confidence of a man who believed he had successfully inherited the earth. I watched him from the edge of the terrace as he barked orders at the waitstaff, his voice projecting a desperate need for authority. He was meticulously micromanaging the event, clearly stressed that every detail needed to be perfect for the cameras of the social media influencers he had invited. He had no idea that I had spent the last 2 weeks systematically dismantling his entire reality. He believed the documents I had left on his desk that morning were simply routine legal filings for the company's annual tax review. He did not realize they were actually the formal notices of asset liquidation, effectively turning the company into a hollow shell that would collapse the moment he tried to make a single withdrawal. Victoria drifted through the crowd, her face a mask of practiced perfection as she greeted the high society elite. She had the audacity to approach me, draping her arm through mine as she smiled for the wedding photographer. She leaned in close, her voice a sharp clinical whisper. She told me to stop looking so miserable and to try and maintain the illusion of a happy father for the duration of the ceremony. She ordered me to stop fidgeting with my watch and to just drink my champagne like a good, obedient guest. Her arrogance was truly breathtaking. She actually believed that in less than 24 hours she would be the legal guardian of my finances and the master of my estate. The intensity of her entitlement was so overwhelming, it was almost difficult to breathe. She leaned away, flashing a brilliant, radiant smile for the camera, as if she were the most devoted daughter-in-law in the world. I stood there watching her perform, knowing that by this time tomorrow, the luxury lifestyle she was so desperate to protect would be nothing but a memory. The sheer cold-blooded malice of their plan to lock my wife in a dementia ward was burning a hole in my pocket. I reached out and adjusted my cufflinks, feeling the cold weight of the metal. I had already confirmed with Agent Carter that the tactical arrest team was positioned on the perimeter of the estate, ready to move the moment I gave the signal. I looked over at Preston, who was currently berating one of the junior executives about the placement of the seating chart. He was completely blind to the fact that he was standing on a trapdoor. He thought he was celebrating his rise to power. He thought he was standing at the pinnacle of his achievement, but he was actually standing on the very edge of the abyss he had meticulously dug for himself. He saw me staring at him, and his face instantly transformed into a mask of impatient, condescending irritation. He walked over to me, grabbed my elbow with unnecessary force, and hissed that I needed to keep my mouth shut and stop staring at people like a confused old man. He told me he couldn't wait for the wedding to be over, so he could finally stop babysitting me and move on to the real business of running the firm. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just offered him a slow, cryptic smile and told him that he was absolutely right, that today was going to be the most memorable day of his entire life. He looked at me with genuine confusion, clearly unnerved by my strange lack of defensiveness. But before he could press me, Victoria reappeared, demanding that he attend to the floral arrangements in the main ballroom. I watched them walk away together, their heads bowed in deep, secretive conversation, still completely oblivious to the fact that their entire criminal enterprise had already been reduced to a worthless hollow shell. The trap was ready, the bait was set, and the executioner was already standing in the shadows, waiting for the final delicious moment to close the net. I finished my drink, took a long, steady breath, and prepared to play my final part in the most important performance of my life. The curtain was about to rise on a tragedy of their own making. The late afternoon sun bathed the manicured lawns of the historic Boston estate. The air was thick with the scent of white orchids and the soft melodies of a live string quartet. 300 guests mingled politely on the sprawling terrace, drinking vintage champagne from crystal flutes. Every detail of the $500,000 wedding had been designed to project an image of untouchable wealth. Victoria had spared no expense, spending a fortune she firmly believed she had successfully stolen from my personal accounts. I sat quietly at the grand head table, perfectly positioned at the center of the massive reception tent. I was wearing my finest black tuxedo, holding a simple glass of iced water. I watched the glittering spectacle unfold before me with the cold precision of a seasoned predator, waiting patiently in the tall grass. Giant ice sculptures slowly melted under the warm evening lights. Waiters in immaculate white jackets moved seamlessly through the crowd, offering silver trays loaded with premium black caviar. I looked at the wealthy investors and local politicians Victoria and Preston had invited. None of them had the slightest idea the magnificent display of luxury they were enjoying was entirely funded by corporate wire fraud. They did not know the beautiful bride circling the room was plotting to chemically sedate her mother-in-law. They did not know the handsome groom smiling brightly for the cameras was actively dismantling his family legacy to appease a violent criminal syndicate. I took a slow sip of my water. Catherine was seated securely in a plush armchair near the edge of the dance floor. She leaned heavily on her wooden cane, acting like a fragile woman overwhelmed by the loud music. As the elegant outdoor lighting illuminated the grand reception tent, the catering staff began pouring fresh champagne. The gentle clinking of silverware signaled that the speeches were about to begin. Harrison Sterling was the first to take the stage. He confidently adjusted his expensive silk tie and grabbed the microphone with the practiced ease of a man addicted to the sound of his own voice. He looked out over the massive crowd, flashing a brilliant, charismatic smile that completely masked the desperate panic I knew was hiding just beneath his skin. I knew his mafia creditors were actively breathing down his neck, demanding their $20 million payment by Monday morning. Yet he stood there projecting the flawless image of an incredibly successful, untouchable business mogul. Harrison raised his glass high into the air. He delivered a booming speech about the magnificent union of two powerful Boston families. He spoke at length about his own success in the international art world, recognizing that exact same relentless ambition in his brilliant new son-in-law. He proudly declared the marriage of Preston and Victoria was the forging of an unstoppable dynasty that would dominate the city for generations. The entire crowd erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. I sat at the head table, clapping my hands together slowly. I looked directly at Harrison. I maintained a perfectly pleasant smile, knowing with absolute certainty his entire fictional empire was going to be completely obliterated in a matter of hours. He took a satisfied sip of his champagne, entirely blind to the federal agents currently surrounding the perimeter of the estate. When the applause died down, Preston stepped up to the microphone to deliver his groom speech. He looked sharp, projecting the perfect image of a young, dynamic corporate leader ready to conquer the world. He started by thanking the hundreds of guests for attending, cracking a few charming jokes that made the audience laugh warmly. But then his voice softened. He expertly shifted his tone, adopting a deeply humble, profoundly emotional demeanor. He turned his body and looked directly at me sitting at the head table. The entire room fell completely silent, captivated by the touching display of filial piety. It was a masterclass in absolute emotional manipulation, delivered flawlessly by a true sociopath. Preston spoke directly into the microphone, his voice dripping with an artificial sweetness that made my stomach physically turn. He publicly thanked me for everything I had ever done for him. He praised my 40 years of hard work, calling me his ultimate role model. He dramatically lowered his voice, telling the crowd how tired I had looked lately, and how the burden of managing my wife's medical decline had taken a toll on my shoulders. He promised me in front of 300 elite guests that I no longer needed to worry about the future of Caldwell Developments. He proudly declared he was ready to take the heavy reins of the company, and that he and Victoria were fully prepared to manage Catherine's care so I could finally get the deep rest I so desperately deserved. The audience visibly swooned. I heard several women sitting at the nearby tables let out soft, sympathetic sighs. A few people even wiped away genuine tears, completely moved by the profound love and dedication of such a wonderful son. They saw a brilliant young man selflessly stepping up to protect his aging, vulnerable parents. I saw a ruthless predator publicly laying the exact psychological groundwork he needed for his upcoming competency petition. He was actively manipulating the entire room, planting the narrative that I was simply too exhausted and fragile to manage my own life. I did not break character. I slowly reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a crisp, white handkerchief. I gently dabbed at the corners of my eyes, playing the role of the deeply moved, incredibly grateful father to absolute perfection. I nodded at Preston, offering him a trembling, emotional smile. He smiled back, his eyes flashing with a dark, greedy triumph. He genuinely thought he had won. He firmly believed his magnificent performance had completely solidified his absolute control over my entire life. He handed the microphone back to the band leader and walked back to his seat beside Victoria. She leaned over and kissed him on the cheek, whispering her congratulations on a flawless speech. I placed the white handkerchief back into my pocket and folded my hands neatly on the table. My phone, resting silently inside my inner jacket pocket, suddenly vibrated once. It was a single, heavily encrypted text message from Jonathan Pierce. The message contained only 2 words. "The board is set." I took another slow, deliberate sip of my iced water. My heart beat with a powerful, unyielding rhythm. The speeches were officially over. The expensive dinner service was coming to a close, and the guests were moving toward the massive wooden dance floor constructed on the lawn. The timeline had officially caught up to the present moment. I kept my eyes locked on Victoria's custom silk wedding dress as she guided Preston toward the center of the terrace for their first dance. The air around the estate grew slightly cooler as the evening breeze rolled in from the nearby harbor. I sat perfectly still, my eyes cold as ice, waiting for the precise, inevitable moment my wife would stumble near the muddy garden path. The final curtain was rising. The final curtain was rising. The string quartet transitioned into a sweeping romantic waltz as Preston and Victoria stepped onto the sprawling custom-built mahogany dance floor. The crowd of 300 elite guests parted seamlessly for them, their faces glowing with manufactured adoration. Victoria looked absolutely radiant in her custom-tailored silk gown. The dress was a masterpiece of European design, cascading behind her in a long, shimmering train of white fabric that swept across the polished wood. She rested her head against Preston's chest, closing her eyes as they swayed gently to the music. They looked like the absolute pinnacle of high society perfection. But sitting there at the head table, I saw nothing but 2 ruthless predators celebrating a victory they had not actually earned. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the edge of the dance floor, watching the exact spot where the polished wood met the decorative garden path. Earlier that afternoon, the landscaping crew had heavily watered the exotic flower beds, leaving a large dark patch of wet soil and thick mud completely exposed near the perimeter. I took a slow, deep breath, setting my glass of iced water down on the crisp white linen tablecloth. I looked across the reception tent and made brief eye contact with Catherine. She was sitting alone in her plush armchair, holding her wooden cane tightly across her lap. She gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It was time. Catherine slowly pushed herself up from the chair. She executed her performance with breathtaking, heartbreaking precision. Her hands trembled visibly as she gripped the heavy handle of her cane. She let her shoulders slump forward, taking incredibly small, uncertain steps toward the edge of the dance floor. To the untrained eye of the surrounding guests, she looked exactly like a fragile, disoriented elderly woman who had simply become confused by the loud music and the flashing lights of the wedding photographers. Several guests politely stepped aside to give her room, casting sympathetic, pitying glances at the mother of the groom as she shuffled aimlessly through the crowd. I felt a sharp pang of protective anger burn fiercely in my chest, watching my brilliant, fiercely independent wife demean herself this way. But I knew it was the only way to expose the absolute darkness hiding inside our son. Catherine navigated the perimeter of the dancing area, moving closer and closer to the damp garden beds. Preston and Victoria were completely lost in their own arrogant world, spinning and laughing in the center of the floor. Victoria threw her head back, her manicured hand resting perfectly on Preston's shoulder, drinking in the attention of her wealthy audience. She spun outward, a choreographed move that sent the massive, heavy train of her expensive silk gown sweeping wide across the edge of the dance floor, directly into Catherine's designated path. Catherine took one halting step forward. The rubber tip of her wooden cane slipped slightly, and her orthopedic shoe came down squarely onto the very edge of Victoria's trailing white fabric. It was a minor misstep, an accident any reasonable person would instantly forgive, especially coming from a woman recovering from a severe stroke. The sudden tug on the heavy fabric caused Victoria to stumble backward slightly, breaking the graceful rhythm of her romantic dance. The beautiful music kept playing, but Victoria froze completely. She looked down at the hem, or shawl, of her immaculate dress, noting the tiny smudge of dirt near the delicate seam. When she raised her head, the meticulously crafted mask of the sweet, loving bride completely vanished into thin air. Her face twisted rapidly into a terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated venom. She did not see a frail mother-in-law making an innocent mistake. She saw a pathetic, senile obstacle ruining her perfect $500,000 spotlight. Victoria did not hesitate. She did not consider the 300 pairs of eyes watching her every single move. Breathing heavily with arrogant fury, she marched directly toward Catherine, raised both of her hands, and violently shoved the 68-year-old woman squarely in the chest. The sheer physical force of the sudden malicious push sent Catherine stumbling wildly backward. She lost her firm grip on her wooden cane, her arms flailing helplessly in the cool evening air as she tried desperately to regain her balance. She tipped backward over the wooden edge of the dance floor and fell incredibly hard into the decorative garden bed. Her body hit the dark, wet soil with a heavy, sickening thud. The thick mud instantly soaked through her elegant evening gown, ruining her carefully styled hair and leaving her completely covered in dark brown filth. The entire grand reception tent descended instantly into absolute horrifying chaos. The string quartet screeched to a sudden, terrible halt, the sharp dissonance of the wooden cello echoing violently across the manicured lawn. 300 wealthy guests gasped aloud in unified, paralyzed horror. The terrible silence that followed was incredibly heavy, broken only by the quiet sound of melting ice shifting in the silver champagne buckets. I stood up quickly from my chair, my aging muscles coiled incredibly tight, fully prepared to sprint across the lawn and tear Victoria apart. But I forced my feet to remain firmly planted on the soft ground. I had to wait. I had to see exactly what my only son would do. This was the ultimate deciding test of his remaining humanity. Preston stood just a few short feet away from his injured mother. Catherine was lying helplessly in the cold mud, struggling to push herself up, looking up directly at her only son for some kind of help. Preston did not rush quickly to her side. He did not reach down and extend his strong hand to gently lift the wonderful woman who had selflessly given him life. He did not loudly reprimand his new bride for violently assaulting an elderly stroke victim in front of a massive crowd. Instead, Preston looked down at his struggling mother with an expression of absolute, unfiltered disgust. He let out a long, highly irritated sigh, acting as if Catherine's humiliating fall was nothing more than a deeply annoying inconvenience to his perfectly planned schedule. He calmly stepped completely over her muddy wooden cane, turned his back on her entirely, and walked directly over to Victoria. He wrapped his arm securely around his bride's waist, pulling her in close to affectionately comfort her over the slight smudge of dirt on her dress. Then, standing in the deafening, uncomfortable silence of the shocked wedding crowd, Preston let out a sharp, remarkably cruel laugh. He leaned down gracefully and whispered directly into Victoria's ear. The highly sensitive microphone of the nearby wedding videographer caught his arrogant voice, perfectly amplifying the terrifying, damning words clearly across the front rows of the reception tent. He told her not to worry about the crazy old woman, loudly promising his bride that by Monday morning, his mother would be securely locked away in a padded room. The final bridge was officially burned. I reached down, grabbed the heavy microphone resting on the table, and prepared to end his entire world. I pushed my chair back, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the floorboards. I stepped out from behind the head table and walked slowly toward the garden bed, where my wife was lying in the damp soil. The reception tent remained locked in a terrifying silence. 300 guests held their breath, watching me carefully. Their eyes darted between my advancing figure and my son, who was holding his bride on the dance floor. Preston watched me approach with mild irritation, assuming I was coming over to fuss over my frail wife and ruin his perfect evening. He simply stood there waiting. I stepped into the dark mud. I knelt beside Catherine. Her evening gown was ruined, stained with wet earth and crushed petals. I gently slid my arms around her shoulders, lifting her up with a steady motion. She leaned against my chest, breathing heavily for the crowd. I carefully guided her back onto the solid surface. I pulled a clean handkerchief from my pocket and began wiping the thick mud from her hands. As I leaned in close to brush a streak of dirt from her cheek, Catherine turned her face away from the crowd. She looked directly into my eyes. The frail, terrified expression she had been wearing instantly vanished. A fierce, brilliant light danced in her eyes, and she gave me a sharp, deliberate wink. She was perfectly fine. Her performance had been absolutely flawless, to guarantee the destruction of the monsters who tried to erase us. I smiled warmly at her, a silent acknowledgement of our shared victory. I gently guided her to a nearby padded chair, making sure she was comfortably seated. I turned my attention back to the center of the room. Preston and Victoria were whispering to each other. They had no idea the spotlight was about to burn them. I began walking directly toward the main stage where the string quartet was sitting in stunned silence. My posture was completely transformed. I was no longer the tired, defeated old man shuffling through the background of my own life. I walked with the undeniable presence of a man who commanded a massive corporate empire. The guests parted immediately, clearing a wide path as I approached the elevated platform. The band leader looked at me with wide eyes. He was holding a wireless microphone resting on a tall metal stand. I reached out and calmly took the microphone from his hands. I stepped to the very front edge of the stage, looking out over the sea of wealthy investors and high society elites. I tapped the top of the microphone twice with my index finger. The sharp thumping echoed loudly. Every conversation ceased. 300 faces turned toward the stage, giving me their undivided attention. I scanned the room, my eyes sweeping over the crowd with calculating precision. I located Preston and Victoria standing near the center of the dance floor. Preston had finally dropped his irritated scowl. He was looking at me with a sudden sense of confusion. He had never seen me look so composed in 6 months. I shifted my gaze toward the front row. I found Harrison Sterling sitting comfortably in a plush velvet chair. He was casually holding a crystal champagne flute, leaning back with the relaxed posture of an untouchable business mogul. He raised his glass slightly in my direction. He offered me a patronizing smile regarding my wife's unfortunate fall. He genuinely thought he had secured his $20 million salvation. He believed his debts were erased. I brought the microphone close to my mouth. My voice was smooth, deep, and absolutely unwavering as it projected across the breathless lawn. "A toast," I announced. The single word hung heavily in the cool evening breeze. I let the silence stretch for a few deliberate seconds, allowing the sheer weight of the moment to settle over the crowd. "We are gathered here tonight to witness the union of two families," I continued calmly. "We are here to celebrate the absolute truth." I saw Victoria shift her weight nervously. Her perfectly manicured fingers tightened their grip on Preston's tuxedo jacket. She did not like the tone of my voice. It lacked the pathetic vulnerability she had worked so hard to cultivate in me. I raised my empty hand into the air, gesturing broadly toward the center of the room. "To my son Preston," I said, my voice echoing. "A young man who has spent months working tirelessly in the dark, orchestrating moves that no one in this room could possibly comprehend. A man who looked at his mother lying in the mud tonight and saw nothing but an incredibly convenient obstacle being finally removed from his path." A low, uncomfortable murmur rippled through the crowd. Guests exchanged alarmed glances. Preston's face lost all of its color. He took a hesitant step forward, paralyzed. I did not give him a chance to interrupt my moment. I immediately turned my commanding gaze toward his bride, and to his beautiful bride, Victoria. I continued, my voice growing colder and sharper with every single syllable spoken. "A woman who values expensive silk gowns and offshore banking accounts far more than basic human decency. A woman who hired a fraudulent holistic nurse to actively pump illegal psychiatric sedatives into my wife's veins." The murmur in the crowd instantly transformed into a collective gasp. Several guests physically stepped away from Preston and Victoria, creating a wide circle of isolation around the couple. Victoria let out a sharp gasp. Her hands flew up to cover her mouth, her eyes darting frantically around the room like a cornered animal, realizing the trap had slammed shut. The pristine illusion she had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to create was shattering. I did not stop. I maintained absolute control of the room. I shifted my focus directly onto the father of the bride. "And finally," I announced loudly. My voice dropped an octave, carrying the lethal weight of an executioner delivering a final verdict. "To Harrison Sterling." Harrison stiffened in his velvet chair. The patronizing smile vanished completely from his face. He sat up straight, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his crystal champagne flute. He looked at me with visceral terror, realizing his darkest secrets were no longer safely hidden. I looked right through him, stripping away every ounce of his manufactured dignity. A man who stood on this very stage just an hour ago boasting about his massive wealth. A man who is actually hiding from a violent Boston criminal syndicate because he owes them $20 million in dirty, untraceable gambling debts. The absolute silence that followed was deafening. The entire reception tent felt as though it had been plunged into a deep vacuum. I held Harrison's terrified gaze firmly, refusing to let him look away from the absolute destruction of his life. I leaned slightly closer to the microphone, ensuring every single guest heard my final devastating sentence with perfect clarity. "To Harrison Sterling," I repeated calmly into the quiet air, "who is officially, completely, and legally bankrupt as of 9 o'clock this morning." For one long, agonizing second, nobody moved. The air was so thick with tension, it felt physically heavy. Then Harrison Sterling's trembling fingers simply gave out. The expensive crystal champagne flute slipped from his grip. It fell toward the ground in slow motion. The fragile glass hit the solid mahogany dance floor and immediately shattered violently. The sharp, explosive sound of breaking crystal echoed across the lawn, signaling the absolute end of their reign. The sharp, explosive sound of breaking crystal echoed across the lawn, signaling the absolute end of their reign. Harrison Sterling fell back into his velvet chair, his face entirely drained of all color. He stared at the shattered remains of his champagne glass, as if he were looking at the scattered fragments of his own life. The massive crowd around him remained frozen in a state of absolute, terrified shock. 300 of the most influential people in Boston were completely paralyzed, their eyes darting rapidly between the ruined father of the bride and the commanding figure I cut on the stage. Preston finally let go of Victoria. He took a hesitant, trembling step toward the head table, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled desperately to find the words to salvage his rapidly crumbling reality. He raised his hands in a pathetic, pleading gesture of appeasement, trying to laugh off my statement as some sort of morbid, tasteless joke. I did not give him the satisfaction of a response. I kept my face entirely devoid of any emotion. I simply raised my left hand and gave a sharp, deliberate nod to Jonathan, who was standing quietly near the main audiovisual control booth at the back of the enormous reception tent. Jonathan immediately signaled the sound engineer. The gentle, romantic ambient lighting that had bathed the terrace in a warm golden glow was instantly extinguished, plunging the dance floor into a stark, dramatic darkness. A massive high-definition projector screen, originally set up to display a montage of childhood photographs, suddenly descended from the structural rigging above the main stage. The bright, harsh light of the projector cut through the darkness, illuminating the terrified faces of my son and his new bride. The screen did not show pictures of a happy couple. Instead, it flashed a series of highly classified, heavily redacted financial documents. The guests gasped as massive bank statements appeared on the screen, detailing the exact unauthorized $4 million wire transfer to the Cayman Islands. The offshore routing numbers, the dummy corporation names, and Preston's forged digital authorization signature were displayed in towering letters for everyone to see. Preston lunged forward, screaming at the sound engineer to cut the power immediately. He demanded that someone turn off the projector, his voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated panic. But before anyone could move, the visual evidence was replaced by something far more devastating. The massive concert speakers surrounding the dance floor crackled to life. The crystal-clear, undeniably authentic voices of Preston and Victoria suddenly echoed across the silent lawn. The recording captured them inside the downtown penthouse, casually sipping scotch, while they plotted the ultimate destruction of my wife and me. The guests stood in paralyzed horror as my son's arrogant voice boomed through the premium speakers. They heard him explicitly complain that my cognitive decline was not happening fast enough. They heard him whine about my lingering presence at the company. But the absolute breaking point came when Victoria's voice filled the night air. The beautiful, elegant bride they had just toasted was heard coldly instructing her fiancé to keep paying the fraudulent, holistic nurse to pump heavy antipsychotics into Catherine's veins. The crowd listened in collective, disgusted silence as Victoria meticulously detailed her plan to file a medical competency petition on Monday morning. They heard her promise to lock both of us in a state-run dementia ward, seize my corporate voting rights, and liquidate my commercial real estate empire to pay off the violent mafia debts her father had incurred. The audio recording ended, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. Several guests physically turned their backs on Preston and Victoria. I saw longtime family friends shaking their heads in absolute revulsion. Victoria was openly sobbing now, the thick layers of her expensive makeup running down her face in dark streaks. She grabbed Preston's arm, begging him to do something to fix the monumental disaster unfolding around them. Preston was completely hyperventilating. The arrogant, untouchable chief operating officer was nothing more than a terrified, cornered child. He looked up at me, standing on the stage, his eyes pleading for a mercy he absolutely did not deserve. I brought the microphone back to my lips. My voice was incredibly calm, slicing through the cool evening breeze with lethal precision. I told Preston that he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. I explained that he had built his entire criminal enterprise on the foolish assumption that I was a weak, clueless old man who could be easily manipulated and discarded. I watched his chest heave as he struggled to process my words. I informed him that while he was busy picking out imported orchids and planning his lavish Caribbean honeymoon, I was systematically dismantling his entire reality. I told him that he had been the chief operating officer of an absolute ghost town for the past 3 weeks. The confusion on his face was palpable. I did not let him speak. I revealed that Caldwell Developments currently held 0 assets. I told him that I had spent 5 agonizing days transferring $150 million in commercial real estate, exclusive patents, and raw liquid capital completely out of the company. I explained that every single dime of my life's work was currently sitting in an impenetrable, irrevocable trust registered in Delaware. The company he thought he controlled was nothing more than a worthless, empty shell. He had no voting rights to seize, no commercial blocks to liquidate, and absolutely no way to pay the violent criminals who were actively hunting his new father-in-law. Preston dropped to his knees right there on the mahogany dance floor. The sheer magnitude of his absolute failure finally crushed the remaining breath from his lungs. Victoria let out a loud hysterical wail, realizing her dreams of endless wealth had evaporated into thin air. I looked down at them with a cold, unrelenting stare. I told Preston that the $4 million he thought he had successfully hidden in the Cayman Islands was entirely frozen by federal authorities. I explained that the offshore account manager he trusted was currently sitting in an interrogation room, actively cooperating with the government. His secret fortune was completely inaccessible. I then addressed the ultimate cruelty of their plan. I spoke directly to Victoria, who was shivering in her ruined, muddy silk gown. I mentioned the medical competency petition they had planned to file on Monday morning. I told her that I had secured a full, comprehensive psychological and physical evaluation from the top neurological specialists in Massachusetts just 3 days ago. I had irrefutable medical proof that Catherine and I were in perfect cognitive health. I told them that their malicious legal petition was entirely useless and that I fully intended to use their fraudulent document as toilet paper. They had absolutely nothing left. Their money, their reputation, their freedom, and their incredibly arrogant illusion of absolute control had all been incinerated in a matter of minutes. The 300 elite guests remained frozen, bearing silent witness to the absolute destruction of a treacherous, incredibly greedy son. Preston buried his face deep in his shaking hands, openly weeping on the polished wood. Harrison Sterling remained slumped in his velvet chair, staring blankly at the shattered crystal on the damp grass, knowing his life was officially over forever. I stood tall on the large stage, my grip firm on the microphone. I had permanently protected my wonderful wife. I had secured my legacy. I had delivered the ultimate devastating punishment to the monsters who had tried to bury us alive. The trap had finally sprung with absolute flawless perfection, leaving them hopelessly trapped in the dark, inescapable abyss of their own monstrous greed. The suffocating silence that had paralyzed the reception tent was suddenly shattered by a sound that cut through the cool Boston night like a razor. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail in the distance, echoing off the historic brick walls of the surrounding estates. Within seconds, the distant wail multiplied, growing louder and more ferocious as a convoy of vehicles approached the main gates of the property. The flashing red and blue lights bounced violently against the white canvas of the grand reception tent, casting long, frantic shadows across the faces of the terrified guests. Preston snapped his head toward the entrance, his eyes wide with the realization that the nightmare was not just financial. The heavy wooden doors of the estate swung open with a resounding crash. A dozen federal agents, flanked by uniformed Boston police officers, poured onto the manicured lawn. They moved with absolute terrifying military precision, their tactical boots tearing through the imported floral arrangements that lined the garden path. The lead investigator, Agent Carter, marched directly toward the dance floor holding up a federal warrant. The guests screamed and scattered, dropping their expensive champagne flutes as the officers flooded the terrace. Panic erupted in every corner of the venue. Preston finally broke. The arrogant son who believed he was destined to rule my empire turned and blindly sprinted toward the back exit of the tent. He did not make it very far. 3 federal agents charged across the lawn, cutting off his escape route. Preston tried to violently pivot his polished leather shoes, slipping on the damp grass. One of the agents lunged forward, grabbing Preston by the shoulder and tackling him hard. They crashed violently into a long catering table, sending silver platters and crystal plates flying into the air. My son was slammed face first onto the ground, his designer tuxedo covered in food and dirt, while the agents pulled his arms behind his back and locked heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. He writhed on the grass, sobbing uncontrollably. Just a few feet away, Victoria was entirely losing her mind. The beautiful, poised art consultant shrieked hysterically as two female officers approached her. She desperately tried to back away, her ruined, muddy silk gown tangling around her legs. She screamed that she was a victim, crying that Preston had forced her into everything, and that she knew absolutely nothing about any offshore accounts or illegal medication. The officers ignored her frantic lies completely. They firmly grabbed her arms, spinning her around, and securing the handcuffs over the delicate lace sleeves of her custom wedding dress. She thrashed against their grip, her elegant bridal updo unraveling into a messy, tangled disaster as they marched her away. Harrison did not run. He did not fight. He simply sat in his plush velvet chair, staring blankly at the shattered crystal on the grass. When Agent Carter approached him and formally read him his rights, Harrison slowly stood up. The arrogant, untouchable businessman looked completely hollowed out, fully recognizing that he would likely spend the rest of his natural life behind the cold steel bars of a federal penitentiary. He offered no resistance as they handcuffed him and led him toward the flashing lights of the squad cars waiting in the driveway. I stood on the elevated stage watching the entire glorious spectacle unfold. The flashing police lights painted the night sky in vibrant colors. The garden was a complete disaster zone littered with broken glass, overturned chairs, and trampled orchids. I slowly walked down the wooden steps and made my way over to Catherine. My incredible wife was standing near her chair, leaning gracefully on her wooden cane, watching the police load her treacherous son into the back of a vehicle. There were no tears left in her eyes. There was only the profound, quiet relief of a woman who had successfully survived a horrific nightmare. I gently wrapped my arm around her waist, drawing her close to my side. She rested her head against my shoulder, letting out a long, peaceful sigh. A terrified venue manager cautiously approached us, stammering an apology about the monumental damage to the property. I reached into my tuxedo pocket, pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills, and pressed the money firmly into his trembling hand to cover the extensive cleanup. I looked down at my wife, offering her a warm, genuine smile. Our corporate empire was finally perfectly safe from their greed. Our physical health was completely, wonderfully intact. The dangerous traitors who tried to bury us were securely caged. I took Catherine's hand in mine, and together we slowly walked away from the ruined reception, stepping out of the darkness and back into the beautiful, quiet peace of our own lives. The greatest mistake a child can make is confusing a parent's unconditional love with blindness. When you weaponize a father's trust and target the mother who raised you, you do not just burn a bridge. You ignite a war you cannot win. Money and ambition can easily cloud a weak mind, leading them to believe that the elderly are easily discarded. But advanced age brings a ruthless kind of wisdom. Always respect those who paved the way for your success, because the hands that built an empire have absolutely no problem tearing it down to protect what truly matters today. If this story of ultimate justice made your blood boil and cheer for the father's brilliant revenge, hit the like button right now. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss another dramatic life story, and let me know in the comments. What would you do to a traitorous son?